As the war in Israel moves into its second month, the Biden administration is now pushing back against Israel's security plan in Gaza. Prime Minister Netanyahu suggests Israel could retain security control over Gaza for an indefinite period. For more on the war, we now turn to Dan Senor, former foreign policy advisor to President Bush and Senator Mitt Romney, and co-author of the new book, The Genius of Israel. Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And yeah, I want to talk about the new book, but I do want to start with that news and the war with Prime Minister Netanyahu suggesting, listen, Israel could very well retain security control over Gaza. We see the Biden administration pushing back there. Dan, what did you make of Netanyahu's comments?
Look, I think the reality is Israel was completely caught off guard on October 7th, was never planning to return to Gaza, left Gaza in 2005. Israel has not occupied Gaza for about 18 years. The last thing Israel wants to do is be back in Gaza, but there was this genocidal war launched on Israel in its southern border, and it has to eradicate Hamas and secure the area, the territory, rather than leave a vacuum there. So there has to be some security forces there. Now, the question becomes, what are the options? It could be the U.S. I'm sure there'll be some who suggest the U.S. should do it. It's the last thing the U.S. should do, and it's the last thing Israel should want the U.S. to do, to have Americans risking their lives in Gaza Strip. There may be some other international force that some could put forward, but Israel, generally speaking, I think would rather just handle the security themselves, not be dependent on any third party, and not have it be permanent. The last thing Israel wants to do, Israel has no political ambition on Gaza, has no religious ambition on Gaza, has no territorial ambition on Gaza. It just wants basic security for its southern border. So even if Israeli security forces are there, it'll just be temporary.
And yet I want to talk about the Israeli economy as well, which you know very well. There have been some 360,000 reservists now called up, and people, of course, need to remember Israel is a small country. It's only about 9 million people in total. Can the Israeli economy, Dan, sustain this war effort?
It's hard. I speak to a lot of VCs. In our book, we write a lot about different venture capitalists who I've been keeping in touch with since, who say about 10% of their portfolio, in their portfolio companies, about 10% of the senior positions in these tech companies are in reserves right now. Now, it's not indefinite, but still, you know what it's like if you're the executive at a tech company. It's in the middle of a fundraising round or involved in some major business development or M&A situation. Suddenly you lose the people, and it just slows everything down. It doesn't shut it down, it just slows things down. So there's a global tech slowdown. Now there's this military situation that's calling on a lot of Israeli talent. If it goes on indefinitely, it's a problem. I don't think it'll go on indefinitely. In the short term, it's definitely a problem. The Israeli economy is going to lose, probably the Bank of Israel says, about 1% of GDP this year, and its other parts of the economy will be shut down too, not just the tech scene. I would add, though, that in 1991, just before 91, Intel had put huge investments in Israel, built a huge center in Israel, wanted to develop the chip that powers our laptops in Israel. And the 91 Gulf War happened, and Iraq was launching Scud missiles into Israel, and the whole country shut down. And the Israel team in Intel still managed to meet every deadline, meet every milestone. So Israelis are used to dealing with this kind of pressure, and they can get quite innovative and resourceful in doing so. I think they'll do the same now, but it's hard.
And Dan, let's talk about President Biden as well. He has stood behind Israel here, supporting Israel. But you look at the Democratic Party, Dan, there is clearly some division there. You heard former President Barack Obama's comments. He seems to think about this conflict differently than Biden. You saw tens of thousands of pro-Palestinian demonstrators marching in Washington over the weekend. Just given that backdrop, Dan, do you expect Biden to continue supporting Israel? Or do you think there's a timeline here?
I have been impressed by President Biden saying he stands by Israel. He flew to Israel, joined the war cabinet, attended a war cabinet meeting, which was quite impressive in the early days of the war. He's deployed considerable military assets in the region. So I think that he's made it clear he's standing by Israel. Of course, there's pressure on him from the left, from his base, and there's pressure from him internationally. But the reality is there's no real alternative to the current plan. Unless Israel does what it needs to do to eradicate Hamas, Hamas is going to continue to be a threat. And as long as Hamas can continue to be a threat, it will provoke and catalyze instability in the region. And so long as there's instability in the region, there's risk of a wider regional war. And that should be the last thing that President Biden wants. It's reminiscent of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which, burst out into a full-on regional war and, became basically a Cold War proxy for the Cold War. So I understand why there's heat on President Biden. I think it's irrational, but I'm seeing it happen, and I'm seeing it from his base in his own party, and I'm seeing it internationally. But what's the alternative? The alternative is not to actually really flush out Hamas. And if you don't really flush out Hamas and Israel isn't able to do it, there's bigger problems that are going to come back to bite the Israelis, and I think therefore the Americans.
And Dan, turning to your new book, The Genius of Israel, I was texting with a buddy of mine, Dan, in Tel Aviv, and he was talking to me about the unity in Israel right now, this real deep, strong sense. He told me a real national connectedness and cohesion. How does your new book, Dan, The Genius of Israel, how does it kind of explain the unity we're seeing among Israelis right now?
So the subtitle is The Surprising Resilience of a Divided Nation in a Turbulent World. So we focus the book on explaining Israeli resilience and how Israelis come together in the most difficult time across all segments, from ultra-Orthodox Jews to ultra-secular Jews living in Tel Aviv and the tech scene, to Jews from North Africa and Jews from Eastern Europe and people in the center of the country and people in the periphery. And we explain in the book the building blocks of how a society holds together. Sure, the country, as we saw over the last year, can be incredibly divided politically, but I think people misunderstand that division. And what Israel also has are societal shock absorbers, these shock absorbers that prevent the country from splitting apart, even though there's real disagreement. So there's the Shabbat. We have a chapter called Thanksgiving Every Week, where overwhelming majority of Israelis, every Friday night, they're with their families, multi-generational, 2, 3, 4 generations, doing the same thing with their family, with the community, and the whole country is sharing in that experience. And it's something that goes throughout the calendar. And there's often people around that table every Friday night who they disagree with a lot politically. The role of the Army, the National Service Program. More countries should have a National Service Program, because not only does it teach these young Israelis at formative years, ages 18, 19, 20, how to develop great skills. Many of them are running these amazing tech companies in Israel, but it also brings people together from all walks of life. So you have people who are, the son of a cab driver and the son of a tech billionaire who are in the same hull of the same tank, in military service together, and they have reserve duty all the way through their 40s. So they have like 20 plus years of this bonding with different parts of this society. When you are forced structurally to be with all walks of life in these different contexts, whether it's every Friday night on the calendar, which is like kind of the civil calendar of Israel, whether it's in the National Service Program, even when there's great division politically in the country, it prevents the country from spinning apart. And when there's war in the country, like there is right now, you start to see how quickly the country mobilizes. People put their differences aside right away because they know each other. The country at the end of the day is like one big family. And we explain in the book how Israel pulled this off, how these building blocks were developed, and we try to focus on what the U.S. and the West can learn from the Israeli experience.
Dan Senor, thank you so much for your time and your insight today, Dan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.